Okay, winding down an interesting week here. I do think we'll get a deal in Iran, a skinny deal over the weekend that just sends us back to what the original ceasefire was supposed to look like, with no U.S. blockade and Iran not interfering with the flow of transit through the strait. That means no tolls. Whether they end up giving something on the nukes will remain to be seen. The degree to which China is willing to flout U.S. sanctions will determine how much leverage Iran has in these negotiations still to come. But let's pivot back to talking about economics. And we got a speech from Governor Waller today, who basically dropped a turd in the punch bowl at the party of his new boss. About an hour before the guy who's getting the job he wanted was being sworn in the White House, Waller gave what by some accounts is his most hawkish speech in 2 years, not pounding the table for a rate hike by any means, but very firmly on hold. But I want to talk about something Waller said more on a philosophical basis about inflation expectations and why he's worried about this supply shock triggering higher inflation. And he talked about supply shocks being idiosyncratic, like a coin flip, where if you know that the probability of heads coming up has nothing to do whether you just got heads or tails 3 times in a row, then you're going to think that each of these events is transitory, basically. But he said people might use something called Bayesian updating, where they think the fact that we've gotten 3 supply shocks in the last few years means that supply shocks are more likely, and therefore they will increase their inflation expectations. Okay, either these supply shocks are idiosyncratic, or maybe they're not. Maybe they're all related to the fact that the world is decoupling. So I think it's reasonable to expect, not from Bayesian updating, but just basic logic about the world around us, that these supply shocks are going to be more frequent. But that has not a damn thing to do with whether inflation is going to be persistently high, because inflation is still a monetary phenomenon. The idea that this is caused by people's expectations has the causality backwards. Expectations do not drive inflation. Accommodative monetary policy drives inflation, which also drives expectations. People aren't stupid. They can see if the Fed is too easy and if the Fed is likely to remain too easy and cause higher inflation. Now, not with great foresight. There wasn't a ton of foresight in 2021 or 22, but clearly there was an elevated expectations problem because they printed $5 trillion and nominal GDP growth was in double digits. So people look at these supply shocks and say they can be inflationary because they look at the 70s and the 2021-22 experience. Okay, the Fed entered both of those supply shocks with nominal GDP at double-digit rates. So we're not in that kind of world right now. So don't confuse the causality. Overly accommodative monetary policy causes inflation. Expectations will tend to precede the actual printing of the CPI at higher rates because people aren't stupid and the CPI lags. But that doesn't mean the expectations cause inflation. If the Fed is in a position of nominal stability, nominal growth's a little hot, 5.5. If they're positioned to keep it there, then even if we have persistent supply shocks, inflation may be 3% instead of 2%, but it's not going to accelerate and expectations will remain contained. If the Fed is in an overly accommodative posture, maybe because AI capex is going to go from $1 trillion to $2 trillion in 9 months or something insane like that, then expectations are going to tick up and they're going to have to tighten. I don't see any sign of that. And furthermore, something to discuss in coming days will be whether this AI capex boom, even if it's generating a little bit of economic heat in the short term, is something that should be addressed with monetary policy. I think not. Bottom line, this Fed is on hold, as in cement shoes. The hurdle to moving in either direction will be extremely high. Talk of a rate hike by year end, or even some are talking about September. Crazy talk, people. This Fed's going nowhere anytime soon. Enjoy the weekend.